It was a beautiful, sunny morning on Maple Grove Street. The Chen family was busy with their morning routine. In their cozy kitchen, Jessica Chen was making lunch boxes while her husband Tom was helping their kids get ready for school. Their daughter Emily was 8 years old, and their little son Jason was 6. The kitchen smelled wonderful. Jessica was cooking Chinese dumplings while Tom made some crispy bacon. This was normal for their family. They loved having both Chinese and American food. Jessica was standing near the kitchen sink when she looked out the window. She saw their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, staring at their house again. Mrs. Peterson was an old lady who moved to their street just 6 months ago. She never talked to anyone in the neighborhood, but Jessica often caught her watching their house. Jessica tried not to think about it too much. Instead, she listened to her daughter Emily talk excitedly about her school project. Emily and her parents had spent the whole weekend making a big model of all the planets in space for her science class. Tom was getting ready to drive the kids to school. As he started backing their car out of their driveway, Jessica noticed something strange. Mrs. Peterson quickly came out of her house onto her front steps. She was holding her phone and writing something while looking at the Chen's car number plate. This made Jessica feel worried, but she tried to stay calm. After all, they had been living in this neighborhood for 5 years now. They had many good friends here, and their children were very happy at their school. But the way Mrs. Peterson kept watching them made Jessica feel uncomfortable. After the kids left for school, Jessica started working. She worked from home as someone who makes pictures and designs for computers. While she was working, she heard people talking outside. She looked out her window and saw Mrs. Peterson talking to another neighbor named Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Peterson was pointing at the Chen's house while talking. Mrs. Roberts didn't seem to agree with whatever Mrs. Peterson was saying. She shook her head and walked away. Mrs. Peterson stayed there alone with her arms crossed. The morning sun was shining on her face, and Jessica could clearly see how Mrs. Peterson was frowning while staring at their house, like she was trying to find something wrong with it. Later that afternoon, Jessica went to her backyard to water her flowers. Her garden was full of beautiful roses and vegetables that she grew herself. While she was watering the plants, she heard Mrs. Peterson talking very loudly on her phone. Jessica couldn't help but listen because Mrs. Peterson's voice was getting louder and louder. "Yes, I'm telling you, something strange is going on in that house," Mrs. Peterson was saying into her phone. "They're always having different people come and go. And they cook such strange-smelling food. I don't think they're like us normal people." Jessica's hands started shaking as she held the water hose. She knew Mrs. Peterson was talking about her family. Just then, Jessica's good friend and next-door neighbor Lisa Johnson came over. Lisa was a kind woman who had helped the Chen family a lot when they first moved in. She saw that Jessica was upset. "Don't let her bother you," Lisa whispered, giving Jessica a warm hug. "Some people just don't understand that what makes our neighborhood special is that we're all different." At 3 o'clock, Tom came back home early from his office because he had a headache. As he parked his car in the driveway, Mrs. Peterson came out of her house again. This time, she had a notebook in her hand and was writing down even more notes. Tom noticed this and felt very uncomfortable. He quickly went inside and told Jessica what he saw. The couple sat at their kitchen table, feeling worried. They had invited some family friends over for dinner that night to celebrate Chinese New Year. They wondered if they should cancel the dinner because of Mrs. Peterson's strange behavior. "No," Tom said firmly, holding Jessica's hand. "This is our home, and we have every right to celebrate our culture with our friends." At 6 o'clock that evening, the Chen's friends started arriving for the Chinese New Year dinner. The Wangs, who lived just 3 streets away, came with their 2 kids. Then the Smiths arrived. They were Tom's work friends who loved learning about Chinese culture. Soon there were 5 families in the Chen's home, and happy voices filled the house. The kitchen was busy with people helping to make dumplings, and the kids were playing together in the living room. The delicious smell of Chinese food spread through the house. Jessica had made her special dumplings, noodles, and spring rolls. Everyone was having a good time, sharing stories and laughing. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Peterson pacing back and forth on her porch. She kept looking at all the cars parked outside the Chen's house, writing things in her notebook and talking on her phone. Around 7:30, when everyone was enjoying their dinner in the backyard, they heard police sirens. 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Chen's house with their lights flashing. The children got scared and ran to their parents. The happy party mood quickly changed to worry and fear. Jessica's hands were shaking as she put down her plate. Tom stood up, trying to stay calm, but his heart was beating fast. Mrs. Peterson was standing on her porch with a satisfied smile on her face. She had called the police, telling them there was a suspicious gathering at the Chen's house with too many strange people coming and going. She had also claimed she heard unusual noises and saw suspicious activities. Officer Williams and Officer Martinez stepped out of their cars. They had been working in this neighborhood for many years and knew the Chen family well. Officer Williams's daughter was even in the same class as Emily. They could see the Chinese New Year decorations through the windows and smelled the delicious food. Both officers looked at each other and shook their heads, already understanding what was really going on. The police officers walked up to the Chen's front door while everyone at the party watched nervously. Tom went to open the door, with Jessica standing close behind him. Their friends stayed in the backyard, trying to keep the children calm. Little Jason was holding onto his mom's leg, asking in a scared voice, "Did we do something wrong, Mommy?" Officer Williams smiled warmly when Tom opened the door. "Good evening, Mr. Chen," he said in a friendly voice. "We got a call about some concerns, but I can see you're having a New Year celebration." He could smell the delicious food and see all the red decorations through the door. Officer Martinez noticed the paper lanterns and smiled, saying, "My family went to a Chinese New Year festival last year. The food was amazing." Mrs. Peterson suddenly came hurrying across the street, still holding her notebook. "Officers," she called out loudly, "I've been keeping track of everything. They have strange people coming and going all the time. They cook weird food that smells up the whole neighborhood. And look at all these cars. This can't be legal." Her face was red with anger as she waved her notebook in the air. Officer Williams turned to Mrs. Peterson and spoke in a serious but calm voice. "Ma'am, having friends over for a cultural celebration is perfectly legal. The Chen family has lived here for years and are well-respected members of our community." Officer Martinez added, "In fact, Mr. Chen volunteers at the local youth center, and Mrs. Chen designs posters for our police department's community events." Mrs. Peterson's mouth fell open in surprise. She hadn't expected the police to defend the Chens. More neighbors started coming out of their houses to see what was happening. Mrs. Roberts, who had walked away from Mrs. Peterson that morning, came over and put her arm around Jessica's shoulders to show her support. While everyone was standing outside, more neighbors started gathering around. Mrs. Peterson's face was getting redder and redder as she realized things weren't going her way. Mr. Garcia from across the street came out with his wife and 3 kids. They were still in their dinner clothes because they could hear everything from their house. "Officers," Mr. Garcia spoke up loudly so everyone could hear. "The Chen family helped us so much when our car broke down last winter. They drove our kids to school for 2 weeks until we could fix it." Then Mrs. Roberts stepped forward and added, "And Jessica makes soup for everyone when they're sick. Last month, when I had the flu, she brought hot soup to my door every day." More stories started pouring in from the neighbors. Mrs. Thompson talked about how Tom had fixed her leaking roof during a storm. The Williams family shared how Emily and Jason always helped their grandmother carry her groceries. Even shy Mr. Anderson, who rarely talked to anyone, spoke up about how the Chen's beautiful garden had inspired him to start his own. Mrs. Peterson started backing away slowly, her notebook hanging loose in her hand. She looked confused and embarrassed. The officers noticed some children peeking out from the Chen's backyard, still looking scared. Officer Martinez walked over to them with a gentle smile and said, "Hey kids, is that the smell of dumplings I notice? Those are my favorite." The kids started to relax a little. Emily, feeling braver now, stepped forward and said in a clear voice, "My mom makes the best dumplings. Would you like to try some?" Both officers looked at Tom and Jessica, silently asking permission. Jessica, with tears of happiness in her eyes, nodded and said, "We have plenty of food. Everyone is welcome." This is what Chinese New Year is all about, bringing people together. What started as a scary moment turned into something amazing. Jessica and Tom invited everyone into their backyard. Not just their original party guests, but all the neighbors who had come out to support them, and even the police officers. Their backyard was decorated with beautiful red lanterns and colorful streamers. The kids started playing together again, their earlier fear forgotten. Jessica began bringing out more food from the kitchen. The dining table was filled with plates of steaming dumplings, noodles with vegetables, spring rolls, and sweet rice cakes. She even brought out extra paper plates and chairs from the garage. Tom was showing Officer Williams and some neighbors how to use chopsticks. and everyone was laughing as they practiced. Mrs. Roberts helped Jessica set up a special table where she taught the kids how to make paper lanterns. Emily was proudly showing her friends the red envelopes called Hong Bao that her grandparents had sent her for New Year. Even Jason, who had been so scared earlier, was now running around playing tag with the other kids. The whole time, Mrs. Peterson stood at the edge of the yard, watching everything. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand how the police visit she planned had turned into this happy celebration. Officer Martinez noticed her standing alone and walked over to her. "Would you like to join us, Mrs. Peterson?" he asked kindly. "There's plenty of food, and I just learned how to use chopsticks, though I'm not very good at it yet." He smiled warmly at her. Mrs. Peterson looked around nervously. She saw how happy everyone was. Neighbors talking and laughing together, kids playing, people trying new foods. She saw Jessica teaching Mrs. Thompson's daughter how to fold paper cranes, and Tom explaining to Mr. Garcia about Chinese New Year traditions. For the first time, she noticed how the Chen family wasn't different or scary at all. They were just people who brought the neighborhood together. Slowly, Mrs. Peterson walked into the backyard. Her hands were shaking a little, and she still held her notebook. Jessica noticed her, and even after everything that happened, walked over with a warm smile and a plate of dumplings. "These are my mother's special recipe," Jessica said kindly. "Would you like to try them?" Mrs. Peterson looked at the plate, then at Jessica's friendly face, and her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Her voice was shaking. "I've been so wrong. All this time I was afraid of things I didn't understand." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her notebook, the one where she had been writing all her suspicious observations about the Chens. With everyone watching, she walked over to the garden trash can and dropped it in. The children, who had been watching curiously, started clapping. This made some of the adults laugh, and soon the nervous feeling in the air disappeared completely. Mrs. Peterson tried her first dumpling, and her eyes widened in surprise. "This is delicious," she said. Jessica beamed with pride and offered to teach her how to make them. As the evening went on, something wonderful happened. Mrs. Peterson started telling stories about how she had moved to the neighborhood after her husband passed away. She had been lonely and scared in a new place, and instead of reaching out to her neighbors, she had let her fears take over. "I didn't know how to be alone," she admitted, wiping her eyes with a napkin that Jason had brought her. "And instead of making friends, I made up stories in my head about people I didn't even try to know." Officer Williams and Officer Martinez stayed for a while longer, enjoying the food and company. Officer Martinez even called his wife to join them after his shift ended. The party that started with police sirens was now filled with the sounds of laughter, children playing, and neighbors getting to know each other better. As the night grew darker, the lanterns in the backyard glowed more beautifully. It was getting late, but nobody wanted to leave. Mrs. Peterson was sitting with Jessica, learning how to fold dumplings with shaking hands. Her first few attempts looked funny, which made everyone laugh, including Mrs. Peterson herself. "I haven't laughed like this in years," she said, wiping happy tears from her eyes. The children had made a big circle on the grass where Emily was teaching everyone a traditional Chinese game her grandmother had taught her. Even the older kids, who usually thought they were too cool for games, were joining in. Jason had fallen asleep on Officer Martinez's wife's lap while she gently stroked his hair. Tom brought out his guitar, and soon people were sharing songs from different cultures. Mr. Garcia taught everyone a Spanish song his mother used to sing, and Mrs. Roberts knew some beautiful Chinese songs from her time teaching in Shanghai. Mrs. Peterson surprised everyone by having a lovely singing voice. She sang an old song that made the older neighbors remember their own childhoods. Around 9:30, parents started gathering their sleepy children to head home. But before anyone left, Mrs. Peterson asked if she could say something. Standing in the middle of the yard, her voice still shaking a little, she said, "I want to apologize to everyone, especially the Chen family. I let fear make me forget what being a good neighbor means. Today taught me that different doesn't mean dangerous. It means we have more things to learn from each other." Jessica walked over and hugged Mrs. Peterson tight. Both women were crying, but these were happy tears. "Next week," Jessica said with a big smile, "you must come over and I'll teach you how to make dumplings properly, and maybe you can teach me some of your favorite recipes too?" Mrs. Peterson nodded eagerly, holding Jessica's hands in hers. In the weeks that followed, Maple Grove Street became a different place, but in the best possible way. Mrs. Peterson, who once spent her days writing suspicious notes, now visited the Chen family almost every week. Every Thursday afternoon, you could find her in Jessica's kitchen, learning to cook Chinese dishes. She even bought special chopsticks with flowers painted on them and proudly showed them to everyone who visited her house. The most amazing change was in Mrs. Peterson's front window. Where she used to stand and watch the Chen's house with suspicion, she now had a beautiful red paper lantern hanging. Emily and Jason had helped her make it during one of their visits. Next to it stood a family photo from the Chinese New Year party, showing Mrs. Peterson surrounded by her new neighbors, all smiling. Jessica and Tom noticed other wonderful changes in the neighborhood too. Their once quiet street was now full of life and friendship. Every Sunday, different families took turns hosting dinner parties. They called it Culture Night. One week they would have Chinese food at the Chen's, the next week Mexican food at the Garcias, and the week after that, Mrs. Peterson would share her family's old Polish recipes. The children on the street started a weekend club in the Chen's backyard. Mrs. Peterson, who used to be scared of children's noise, now sat in her garden and waved to them as they played. She even taught them how to grow sunflowers, and soon, every house on the street had bright yellow flowers growing in their front yards. One day, Officers Williams and Martinez drove by on patrol and couldn't believe what they saw. The whole street was decorated with different cultural flags and flowers. Mrs. Peterson was in her front yard, practicing Tai Chi with Jessica, while Tom and Mr. Garcia were setting up tables for another neighborhood dinner. The officers smiled, remembering how one scary evening had changed everything. One sunny Saturday, exactly 3 months after that memorable Chinese New Year night, Jessica and Tom were surprised by a knock on their door. When they opened it, Mrs. Peterson was standing there with a big smile holding a cream-colored envelope. "You need to come to my backyard right now," she said excitedly, "and bring Emily and Jason, too." When the Chen family walked through Mrs. Peterson's garden gate, they couldn't believe their eyes. Her entire backyard had been transformed. Every neighbor from Maple Grove Street was there, standing under strings of lights and paper lanterns. A big banner hung between 2 trees reading, "Thank you for making our street a home. We love our Chen family." Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her hands shaking with happy nervousness. "After that night," she began, her voice full of emotion, "I realized how wrong I was and how much I almost lost by being afraid of people who were different from me. But you didn't just forgive me, you taught me, welcomed me, and showed me what community really means." She handed Jessica and Tom the envelope. Inside was a certificate from the city council. The neighbors had all written letters explaining how the Chen family had changed their street. Because of these letters, Maple Grove had been chosen as Community of the Year. The prize money would be used to build a community garden where everyone could grow flowers and vegetables together and share their cultural farming traditions. The garden would be named Chen Peterson Friendship Garden to remind everyone how fear can turn into friendship when people open their hearts. Mrs. Peterson had already donated a piece of her large yard for the garden. Tears rolled down Jessica's cheeks as she looked at the garden design. It included Chinese elements like a moon gate, Polish flowers that Mrs. Peterson remembered from her childhood, and plants from every family's cultural background.